that is often discussed. Look at the legislation. It's 30 days for the Treasurer to make a decision, 10 days in which to notify of the decision. So, in 1975 we used carrier pigeons. It took 10 days to send a letter out. But also there's an up to 90-day process. If the decision can't be made, you've got 90 days of potential interim order. Now, a lot of people see the withdrawal process. It's not in the legislation. Now, I confess to being one of the first people to put in place the withdrawal process in the late 80s, because what you don't want with the interim order process is a public published document that names the parties, names the proposal and uses the word prohibited. Now, I'm sure Sean on a good day could actually write a great story on how terrible that would be. So you don't want that publicity. So the withdrawal process is used. That's something that Treasury actually allows. They understand, particularly in market-sensitive transactions, the adverse impact of an interim order. So that whilst the ADM application was lodged in May of 2013, Hockey, when he comes in, Treasurer Hockey, when he comes in, actually signs off on an interim order and gives a 90-day, in fact it wasn't quite 90 days, because you can bring it in earlier, but he actually issued an interim order. But between May and September, the ADM advisors were every 30 days withdrawing and relodging. Now, there's nothing wrong about that, and that is a standard process. So people that see some evil in that need to understand that it is back to that discussion between the applicant and the government. It's not about everyone else trying to get their eyes in on what's happening in the transaction. But one of the fundamental things that was absolutely missing from the ADM story was the visit by the head of ADM to Australia. She came out and the deal was clearly staggering. She got some negative press. She held a lunch in Melbourne, invited some politicians as well. I think she went to a couple of sites, but what she did not do was come to Canberra. Fundamental mistake. She should have come to Canberra, parked at the Hyatt for a week, gone up to the Hill, Parliament House, seen the Treasurer, the Assistant Treasurer, the opposition spokesman, all the politicians that were having issues, and do the rounds of the bureaucrats. Get the Treasury staff on side, get the Department of Agriculture on side. But she didn't do it. I don't know why. I don't know what the advice would have been, but she should have come to Canberra, and that I think was unfortunate, because again you get to that great press release where they've got that great story, we're going to bang a lot of hundreds of $1 million into infrastructure, and it didn't happen. And that was in the week leading up to the decision, and of course by that stage it was all too little too late. So what was the decision itself? So as we now know, the decision was to prohibit the proposed acquisition of GrainCorp. Can't go ahead and take over. It is only the third prohibition this century. And some people are trying to say recently that this is something terrible and it's a horrible thing for Australian investment. It's not when you view it against the real approvals that are happening day in, day out. The other two were Shell and Woodside, as I mentioned before, under Treasurer Costello, and of course the SGX ASX proposal that was rejected under Treasurer Swan. And again, whilst that wasn't quite an election year, it was a minority government, and if he had to put that through the lower house, where the government didn't have the numbers, that would have been a rejection of the Treasurer and could well have started a no confidence motion. So it was far easier for the Treasurer to say no to the SGX, particularly since they weren't going to budge on conditions. Now, personally, when I was being asked about what the decision would be, I was predicting a heavily conditioned approval. It would be one where the Treasurer could have shown that we do have a regime that can be all things to all people. And whilst I did double my risk of a prohibition from 10 to 20% in that last week, I simply got it wrong. Because we got it wrong because we didn't know until the decision two very important factors. And again, this is about that transparency, and we're just not going to get to see things. First time ever, as far as I know, the Foreign Investment Review Board was split. Some were wanting to approve with conditions, others were saying definitely not. And the other point that we didn't know was apparently ADM did not want conditions attached to their approval. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that we don't know who on the board had particular views. After all, the board is not the decision maker. The Treasurer is. But if you think about it, it makes it very hard for the Treasurer to make a decision where his principal advisor, the board, set up to advise him, can't give him clear direction. And particularly if you then start to think about, could the Treasurer impose conditions? What would the board then be looking at as enforcement? And on top of that, of course, as I said, ADM did not want conditions, which is actually really surprising because, we've just gone through the history, the sensitivity around rural space. They would have to have expected conditions. You can't suggest that they would have turned up and said, oh, we're just going to put in an application and get a tick. Because that view then becomes very binary, as one of our colleagues keeps saying to us in foreign investment. It becomes yes or no, and they got to know. So perhaps an attitude that they might revisit if they look at conditions going forward. Now, one of the things the Treasurer did take into account in his decision was the deregulating nature of the industry and the steps being taken toward competition. Interesting thing though is at the end of the day, GrainCorp starts as pretty much a monopoly on the East Coast, and it's still a monopoly on the East Coast after the decision's failed. So nothing's really changed. So really, other than perhaps suggesting that some sort of competition should be forced upon GrainCorp in the future, the decision appears more to say that the government did not want ADM running that monopoly. And when you talk about competition, as I said before, this is where I was going to declare my hand about the South Australian connection. At Christmas time, I was having a drink with a wheat farmer, and his phone kept buzzing on the table. It was constant. It kept buzzing. And I said, gee, you're a popular guy. And he said, oh no, he said that's just the grain traders. They want my grain. He said, it's Glencore, Viterra, it's Topfer. They're all wanting it. I said, well, what do? Do you actually take advantage of all this competition? Do you look at the prices and see what happens? He said, no. So I just do what my old man did. Sell to AWB. So, actually he said whoever owns AWB at the moment. But it just sort of suggests there might be, as the Treasurer did indicate, there is still some way to go before we get deregulation truly set in. But one of the interesting things about the decision is right at the very end you have the Treasurer actually allows ADM to increase their shareholding. Very strange number. He allows them to go to 24.9%. I don't know where that's come from. You can't relate that to any Corporations Act number other than the fact that it sits just below a quarter, perhaps. But it does indicate that the Treasurer is prepared to allow ADM to show its bona fides, and that's what he's looking for when they do increase and play a role as a greater shareholder. They still don't have a board member, I don't think, if someone wants to correct me on that. So it'll be interesting to see if they do participate more actively. So then what have we learned in the foreign investment space from the decision? Well, we do actually have a new criterion in the national interest space. Not definitional, but certainly something we need to now give some weight to. And what the Treasurer said was this. He said, when considering the national interest, FIRB should specifically have regard to the impact the decision on a proposal would have on broader Australian support for foreign investment and the foreign investment regime into the future. Now, this is a weighting only, and to be honest, I haven't seen it raise its head in any of the proposals since the rejection. But you've got to be mindful, really, that the scope for whipping up anti-foreign investment sentiment in Australia, it's very simple. It doesn't take too much. So if that was the sole weighting, you'd probably see the end of foreign investment full stop. The other thing just to bear in mind too, as a result of this and what we see coming out of, and the Prime Minister is the one who's actually pushed this line, is that what they really want to see is proposals that involve some form of value add to Australia, where instead of simply buying the farm, they are going to develop the farm. So those sorts of proposals will continue to gain approvals without too much difficulty.